Our final presenter is Ashwad Shirley, whose paper applies advanced econometric methods, and I'm jealous because I can't do that for St. Martin, including SVAR and local projection models to evaluate how Jamaica's fiscal system responds to macroeconomic shocks. His discussant is another good colleague of mine at the CBCS, Dr. Shakina Dare. Mr. Shirley, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It seems I have the honor of closing the research presentations portion of this auspicious event. I'll do my best to awake you guys for the upcoming events this evening. The motivation for this study is quite simple. Jamaica is at a turning point in its fiscal journey, and understanding how fiscal variables react to macroeconomic shocks is going to be an important thing to know along this new path that we might be on. As you know, we just had a hurricane shock. It would be good to try to develop some fiscal multipliers that we could actually have had to apply to those and improve our current methodologies. So Jamaica has long faced structural and fiscal issues. Historically, my colleague Dr. Harris would have highlighted a lot of those, but let me just reiterate, we suffered from low economic growth, high inflation, and subsequently tight monetary policy through high interest rates. We had large and chronic trade deficits and episodes of significant currency devaluation and depreciation. On the fiscal side, we had, of course, persistently high budget deficits and high public debt burdens. But over the last decade or so, Jamaica has actually implemented a set of fiscal policy reforms and monetary policy reforms, such as a fiscal rule and a monetary policy committee, which have led to improvements in the macroeconomic and fiscal environment. However, recent shocks do show that there are still some fiscal vulnerabilities, and if there is an adverse shock, we would like to know how the fiscal variables would respond so that we can have some insights about how to actually adjust fiscal policy going forward. So I'll just recap some of the typical outcomes in the literature of macroeconomic shocks. So economic growth, as we all know, strengthens the fiscal position, and that comes out in the literature a lot by raising tax revenues and lowering debt in the long run. Though if growth is financed by borrowing, particularly from external sources, you could actually end up with adverse situations where you end up with high debt in the long run. Inflation is positive generally in the short run, but if there's an adverse inflation shock and there's a contractionary monetary policy, of course, that would have an adverse effect on debt and could erode any fiscal gains that you might have in the long run. That's a theme that comes out in the literature. Interest rates, of course, worsen debt burdens and can trigger fiscal tightening if that interest expenditure increases a lot. That non-interest expenditure would have to adjust downwards, and that could actually have a negative outcome for the economy as a whole. And of course, exchange rate depreciation is particularly important for countries like Jamaica that have a high debt burden. And trade has mixed effects. It depends on your economic composition. You can benefit or be worse off depending on depending on what you are exporting or importing. So the variables that we'll include today are all relevant fiscal variables, including public debt, primary balance, tax revenues, and government expenditure. These variables will be included in our models at a quarterly frequency and will be represented in nominal levels. We're using nominal levels because inherently the government naturally operates in nominal variables. The government's intertemporal budget constraint is nominal, and that budget constraint inherently captures the effects of other variables, including inflation. Variables will be seasonally adjusted and log differenced to remove any scale issues and nonlinearities as best as possible. And we're Windsorizing outliers because, of course, using such a long history, as you know, Jamaica has shocks all over the place that could affect the results. And of course, some of those, like the IMF programs, are going to be captured via dummy variables. The macroeconomic variables are the standard ones. We're going from real GDP, headline inflation, or headline CPI, interest rates, exchange rate, and of course, the trade balance. All right, so the models that will be used today are, firstly, we are using an SVAR as our main model framework, as it allows for the imposition of economic theory and structure that could also be determined from previous empirical research. And we're going to impose some lag restrictions on that SVAR model, particularly on the fiscal variables, where we constrain the primary balance to respond only to revenues and expenditures and also public debt, but not directly to the macroeconomic conditions. Debt, on the other hand, is responding to the primary balance and the macroeconomic conditions, capturing that intertemporal budget constraint. And this would actually reduce the number of parameters that we would have to estimate and enforces some temporal consistencies. I should also say that revenues and expenditures are not reacting historically to the primary balance either. In terms of the identifying restrictions, we are using a contemporaneous restriction, or the AB model. We are going to leverage the Blanchard and Perotti 2002 cyclically adjusted primary balance framework, where we're going to separate or try to decompose the government shocks into automatic, systemic, and discretionary shocks. And we're going to impose additional restrictions that reflect Keynesian or Keynesian Phillips curve and monetary policy channels, such as the UIP and the trade-off between inflation and output. And so those restrictions would be included. And then as an alternative model, we're going to test whether including spending as being exogenous to the business cycle, meaning it enters the equation first, it has any effect on the model as opposed to it being affected by business cycle fluctuations. And of course, our alternative framework is a local projection model. We suspect that there are some nonlinearities in government behavior, and our hope is that the local projection model will eke out some of those responses. Just quickly, the Blanchard and Perotti framework introduced the concept of cyclically adjusted balances. As an example, the cyclically adjusted tax revenues, that's URTECA, would be equal to its discretionary component, that's in green, plus, or in this case, well, minus its automatic responses to the business cycle fluctuations, and then by accounting for these two, we can derive the structural behavior of the government, which is on the right-hand side of the equation. Just to go quickly, once we set up the cyclically adjusted spending and revenues, conceptually we can derive a cyclically adjusted primary balance. And if we assume that the government can adjust the policy levels individually, then those feedback loops, we can assume that they'll be zero. For example, a government can want to target a particular primary balance by changing tax revenues only or changing the spending only. That's the assumption here. And then that would capture the structural behavior of the government. And of course, in this formulation could explain why governments can attain persistently high budget deficits or rack up savings and reduce debt. Of course, our local projection model is quite simple. We're just using the simplest version to see if there are any nonlinearities that exist in the data that could affect our results. Our SVAR model was run and it passed all relevant diagnostic tests. So let's just discuss variables and results quickly. First thing I want to note is that I'm going to go through each shock successively, starting from a real GDP growth shock. And the first thing to note is that these bands are very wide. And inherently, government behavior, particularly spending behavior, are policy driven, and they might not necessarily react or you expect to macroeconomic shocks, particularly if a government has targets that it needs to meet. So that's how you might end up with these wide bands. At the top of the right-hand side, I have the macroeconomic responses just listed out. So from a one standard deviation structural GDP shock, just going quickly, we see that revenues increase, of course, and an increase in revenues obviously expands the fiscal space seen in the primary balance, and that could allow the government to increase spending in the economy while also lowering long-term debt. And all of this would be consistent with what we expect from fiscal accounting framework and the intertemporal budget constraint. Looking at a headline inflation shock, we see that we actually have a overall worsening of the fiscal environment, ending up with higher public debt, and that could be coming from the higher interest rates that are from the economic or macroeconomic responses. And that is, of course, despite the short-term revenue gains that you see in the top right-hand chart. Over the long run, we see that there's a constraining of government expenditure, and that's what I mentioned earlier. It could mean that higher interest expenditure could cause the government to constrain non-interest expenses to try to contain that debt increase. So I found that to be a very interesting result. In our third, we are shocking nominal interest rates directly. We see a sharp rise in debt over the near term. And of course, given that a contractionary monetary policy, especially an unexpected one, would contract GDP and lower inflation, we see that the revenues are actually lower than they would have been. And of course, higher interest might mean higher interest expenditures, and that would mean that the government's expenditure overall might increase. Just trying to explain these. And of course, if you have a higher debt path, you might need to run higher primary balances to, of course, contain that debt increase in the longer run. But you still end up with the overall worsening of the fiscal environment. Let's look at the exchange rate depreciation shock. Overall, of course, given the high debt burden, particularly external debt, this is an overall worsening of the fiscal environment. And we notice that there's not even any gains from imported receipts that you'd expect from that. So that's just an overall worsening. Looking at our trade balance shock, we see that's an overall improvement of the fiscal environment. And the trade balance shock is a bit difficult to discuss because it depends on what is changing. It could be that you have an increase in exports or a decrease in imports. Judging by the revenue response, it seems as if it could be this model is suggesting that this is coming from the imports being lower. That's why tax revenues might be lower. And of course, that could also signal other weaknesses. Might be domestic economy might be weaker than expected, but still, it suggests an overall improvement in the fiscal environment. Looking at the decompositions of the fiscal variables, the main thing we want to highlight is that government expenditure seems to have a very high inertia, suggesting a ratcheting effect, meaning that government spending policies might be difficult to draw back, whereas if the tax revenues are more responsive to the macroeconomic environment, particularly GDP growth and trade. And of course, by design, our primary balance responds mainly to the spending and tax revenue variables. Interestingly, this model suggests that the debt accumulation is primarily driven by the nominal interest rate. But over the long run, these macroeconomic variables begin to play a bigger role. On to our sensitivity analysis, just a quick check. Remember I mentioned that alternative SVAR ordering, where we assume that the government spending is in fact responsive to business cycle fluctuations contemporaneously. In doing so, we notice that there is no main difference, no real difference in the impulse responses between these orderings, and we could conclude that the model is at least robust to this type of ordering misspecification. Just a quick look at the local projection results versus the SVAR results. In a structural real GDP shock, we are getting quite similar results as mentioned. However, the local projections seem to suggest more significant and pronounced responses, particularly coming from the revenues and spending. And of course, that would mean that given the revenue response being so much stronger, the debt response seems to be particularly strong as well, but generally directionally similar. In looking at the headline CPI shock, I would say they are broadly similar but diverge in terms of the debt paths. And of course, the local projections is suggesting that the revenue gains are a little better in the end of the near term, or that particularly the spending is actually lower, and that could be what is driving the debt response lower. This one was quite interesting. The local projections after nominal interest rate shock show widely divergent debt and revenue effects. And just to point it out, while the spending response is similar, I found that the local projection suggested that interest rate shock increased GDP. Now, inside our model, due to data restraints, we're using basically supply side GDP. So one explanation could be that depending on the regime you're in, a slightly higher interest rate could actually increase investment and increase long-run GDP. But personally, I'm not buying that. So one thing we could do is to look at this and do some direct regime-dependent research. But because of that GDP response, the revenue response in the local projection is positive, and that is actually forcing the debt lower, which is inconsistent with what we would expect, and inconsistent with the SVAR, which was restricted to the theory. Finally, now second to last is the nominal exchange rate. I would say that they are broadly similar with just some differences in the timing and the extreme levels of the paths. For the trade balance, again, I would say that they are broadly similar and consistent. It's just worth noting that the local projection suggests that the improvement in the trade balance has a much stronger twin deficit channeling to the debt than the SVAR would suggest. And that seems to be a theme with the local projections. Much stronger responses overall. To summarize, it's noteworthy that the model confirms that growth is strengthening the fiscal position, but so too is trade balance, whereas adverse inflation, interest rate, and exchange rate shocks actually weaken fiscal health, and that highlights the importance of monetary policy and fiscal policy coordination in a small open economy. The local projection model seems to be broadly consistent with the SVAR, but we would have to look into perhaps there could be some regime-dependent behavior. And just to conclude, I would just recommend that the government use growth booms to build fiscal buffers and actually, because of the ratcheting effect, develop clear exit plans from their spending policies to mitigate potential issues in the long run. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shirley. Oh, can you bring the clicker for us, please? Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Shirley. You had the honor of rounding off the conference as our final speaker. Thank you for that. And the floor is now yours, Dr. Dare.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm actually very excited to be here because while reading the paper, I was like, wow, there is a lot of information for Jamaica while being a small open economy and still being able to conduct such an amazing research. I was very much impressed. So without further ado, I want to start right away with the strengths. The first one is a strong policy relevance that I see, especially given the broad macroeconomic shocks that have been investigated in this research, linking it to fiscal sustainability from different perspectives, which it's not only being used or can be used by academic people, but at the same time also by policymakers. This brings me also to the next strength, which is the empirical methodology, where SVAR is being used accompanied by LP, local projections. While SVAR provides the opportunity to do structural interpretations, the LP provides the opportunity to incorporate nonlinear relationships and also heterogeneity, which is a very nice benefit to complement each other and making this paper very empirically strong. At the same time, while still being a small economy, being able to use quarterly data from 1998 up until 2024 and quarterly data, this makes it quite a large, relatively large data set. And at the same time, being aware of different structural breaks and correcting for that, such as COVID-19 pandemic, domestic financial crises, IMF reforms, this results in increasing the credibility of the quality of the paper as well. This brings me to the next strength, which is clear results. Clear and intuitive results, while at the same time being able to look into the different literature that is existent, while being able also to look at the different results and seeing that some of them or most of them are also in line with already existent literature, leading to also external validity. At the same time, the recommendations provide room for policymakers to be able to grasp certain areas where they can implement it in their policies. And finally, I want to give a general compliment while reading it. It was very well written, very well structured, and very well referenced. So thank you for that. So moving on to some improvement areas, I would recommend, and these are some, let's say, discussion items that maybe we can talk about later if you prefer, or also dig into further details during maybe the break or after the conference, so feel free for that. In any case, specifically for the abstract, I would recommend to make it a bit more leaner, because right now it's quite long and dense, and especially because of the in-text references, it removes the part where we want to focus in the abstract on the takeaways and the key highlights for policymakers to be able to implement. At the same time, while I know that generally speaking, SVAR combined with LP could cover the endogeneity or potential endogeneity concerns, it would still be helpful for the reader to be able to discuss explicitly how these concerns have been implemented, or what were the, let's say, the different areas that were discussed in terms of pros and cons related to these concerns while using the methods implemented. And thirdly, it would be nice, because of the fact that this paper is very empirically strong, it would be good to connect the findings a bit more towards Jamaica's institutional realities. So, for example, it's very nice to see indeed the empirical results showing, for example, the expenditure inertia, but it would be good also to discuss why is this the case specifically in the Jamaican context, while at the same time discussing how tax composition shapes responsiveness specifically within the Jamaican context. And finally, this is just my personal preference, also makes it a bit more useful for, or a bit easier for policymakers to grasp it. Maybe have like a one-pager, or maybe even like an infographic type of one-pager, where you can see on one page how the different results connect to each other, so that it's much easier to be able to grasp all the information. Since it's a lot of information, it's comprehensive, which is a plus, but at the same time can be challenging for the reader, especially when it's a policymaker who might not necessarily work on a daily basis with empirical findings. That brings me to the final area where I want to finalize with the following two sentences. This is a policy-relevant paper that combines strong econometric work with clear implications for Jamaica's fiscal management. With minor refinements, it could serve as an example for fiscal macro analysis in small open economies. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dare. Mr. Shirley, would you like a little time to collect, or should I go to the floor? It's your choice. Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, thank you for your comments. I really appreciate them. And I'm very happy that they're generally positive. I was very worried about just the empirical nature of the paper. I knew it was a very long paper to read, so I was also worried about that. One of the questions you asked is about the inclusion of the real-world linkages of the results. That's something I personally try to shy away from in our, to be frank, political environment. But we do have policies that are hard to claw back once they are implemented because of social or political pressure. So, and this happens in economies all over the world. So you might implement a social program that, for example, I'll just say school lunches, and the economy might be in a position where you no longer need that, but it is just politically unfavorable to roll back those programs. So you have government spending ratcheting up, and that's what we probably see in the results. In terms of the tax responses, taxes frankly did also have a relatively high inertia. However, we found a bit more responsiveness, and I think that inertia also comes from just institutional inefficiencies. So if the institutions aren't efficient, such as the collection or tax administration in general, then a rise in GDP might not necessarily see 100% buoyancy in tax revenues. And so we have institutional issues that could be affecting the tax responses, and of course, social and political pressures that could be affecting the spending responses. In terms of the improvements that you suggested to the paper, of course, I will explore them and try to include them. I also thought the abstract was a bit long, but I wanted to just highlight the results up front. But maybe highlighting a results page could just allow me to move a lot of those numbers from the abstract to a one-pager and improve the readability of the paper. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. Is there any comment or question from the floor at this stage? No? Going once? Going twice? All right. I'm sorry, someone back there? No? All right. Thank you so much. This was a very high-level discussion, high-level technical paper. Really enjoyed it. Thank you both for your time and your both presentations. We had a presentation and a mini presentation. The closing style. The closing style. Thank you.